Everything on the website.
Okay. Now it's being recorded.
Okay.
So thank you for hosting me. It's an amazing opportunity for me to be here at this institute. I'm visiting some research groups, and I was passing by Bologna and then thought maybe there is a chance, and luckily, thanks to OSALP, this opportunity become real. So I would like to, well, I have a seminar to give, but since the introduction opened up for explaining a little bit more of the context behind the talk, I would like to introduce myself briefly. Well, as he said, my name is Thomas Velos. I'm an interdisciplinary researcher. My background comes from technical, let's say mathematical sciences. I have background in physics, mathematics, and computer science. And then I moved into the modeling of interdisciplinary systems, complex systems mainly, and with broad applications in anthropology, psychology, biology, or cognitive science, etc. So my profile is the researcher, our modeler, who takes phenomenon and make some sort of formalization of this phenomenon. So let's say it can be logic or equations or any sort of mathematical structures that accommodate to the, let's say, epistemology that we attribute to the phenomenon to have. So that's more or less what I do. And the current project, which is the one projected in this website, is the project that is supporting what I'm doing now, which is funded by the John Templeton Foundation and hosted by the Centre Leo Apostel, which, by the way, it's one of the pioneering institutes in the world to do transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary research. They are running their institute from the early 90s. So they were super ahead in time in this idea, which now it's kind of super popular to integrate worldviews and all these ideas, fragmented perspectives, which I will speak about briefly today. So we got together this grant with a group here, which I will briefly also mention is Shima Beiji, who is an expert in resilience at the level of engineering, and Evo Buciniers, who is a mathematician also who did his PhD in for generation hierarchies, so mathematics of anarchism, that's his topic. Francis Heiligen, who is a figure at the Belgian at least level and maybe worldwide in the cybernetics. Marta Lenartowicz, who is she comes from humanities and political science, sociology, etc. And me and this PhD student we have doing the code of our ideas, Pedro Maldonado. So this is our team, and what we work is in the science of purpose. The science of purpose is one of the lines that the John Templeton Foundation is trying to fund, and they expect for this century, and as I do as well, to develop a scientific paradigm for the notion of purpose, for the notion of goal, or for some notions that nowadays do not have really a solid scientific background. They are used in different fields, either in, as I said, in management, science, in psychology, or in biology. They speak about purpose or goals, but there are no, let's say, solid scientific or even philosophical foundations to start from. So we believe that this there is a strong need to do this kind of questions in this century, now that data is not an issue, now that computation is not an issue. I mean, not like in the previous century. So it's a completely, we have like very strong muscle to do these kind of things, which this previous century we didn't have. So now maybe we expect that it's time to start asking these questions. So the idea is to find the right framework to do that. And that's what we are going to propose. And I will do just a very general presentation of how this could be done. Okay, so now I move to the presentation. I guess that if I keep this here, I can, or maybe this, back and forth. Yeah. Okay, so this is the presentation. I wonder if this can be taken off.
Please take that conversation in box. That's pop up with my name on it. Click the not to the left. Okay.
It's already there.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, there is a problem though. On my control computer, I don't see the screen.
Oh.
No.
No?
It's not coming out. It's still with the previous slide.
Metti in pausa, nuova condivisione. Ok, metto il schermo. O questa?
No, schermo.
Si vede?
Yes, now it's fine.
Okay.
Okay, you can leave it. It's not a problem.
It's do you see this bar? No.
No.
Okay, then nobody, the audience then doesn't see. Okay, so now we start. I will start properly the talk, and just the last but not least thing to say is that at the Centro Leo Apostol, which I've been a postdoc for the last 5-6 months, but I've been working for lots of years with them. I am now starting a research group on I'm directing, and it's called Systemic Modeling Group. So what we do is a systemic thinking applied to modeling interdisciplinary phenomena. So this is why I'm so interested and happy to be here, because I have the impression that we might be able to do collaborations in the future. So yeah, okay, towards systemic modeling of goal-directedness. And this is a little outline. So I try to motivate first the idea, and then I will go for a general view of how complex systems are modeled, what are the problems of current, let's say, approaches or frameworks to model complex systems, and then I will propose the framework of reaction networks as one that might solve some of the problems, and why this COT, which is the chemical organization theory, a particular framework of reaction networks, can be used as a modeling language, which allows for very interesting features for thinking and modeling complex systems in general. So this is all motivated, as I said before, by the notion of goal. And if we think in most applications that try to formalize or define what a goal is, normally the idea is that the goal is set in advance. The goal is set in advance, and then the idea to get to the goal is just an optimization process in most cases. So, and it's a dominant paradigm in engineering mainly, that comes, of course, from the principles of variational principles in physics. Then they were taken to everything. So the idea is that every system tries to find some sort of minimum at some point, and that, paradigmatically speaking, that's how things evolve in general. So this is it's a paradigm in science that things evolve optimizing something, and we have this very clearly shown. For example, in the paradigm of evolutionary theory, it's about optimizing some fitness function that is defined by the species, by the environment, and so on. But there is an optimization process. Or in economics, the paradigm is expected utility optimization or variations of it, but it's always optimization. Expected utility, or it can be expected regret, or common happiness, or something which in the end can be formalized as some form of utility, or something maybe not necessarily falling into the philosophical definition of what utility is, but some sort of variable that is going to be optimized. If we go for cell metabolism or even ecosystems, there is an idea of biomass production, that the energy converted into biomass have to be optimized, and this is the way in which cell models or metabolic models are solved. These are constraints imposed to the equations of the cell metabolism or general biological or biochemical systems, let's say, to guess how they will behave. And it turns out that it explains most of what we see. So it's a good idea. I'm not against that, of course. It's the current paradigm, and intelligence, consciousness, and all this. You probably know this popular guy, which is Carl Friston. He is a very famous guy nowadays, introducing some variational principles or optimization principles to explain what consciousness is in terms of representational. I'm not an expert, but I know a little bit the idea that he uses some information theoretical measurements combined with variational principles to define like predictability or something similar to that to explain what consciousness might be. And in the case of intelligence, which is maybe a similar field, we always think of how to define intelligence in terms of either representation or prediction or problem solving. There must be some capacity that we are striving to get better at. So the typical image of optimization is moving through a fitness landscape and trying to find the local or hopefully global minimum. So this is the paradigm. And the most advanced methods nowadays involve adaptive processes, which mean like the fitness landscape, which this function can change over time, and if our actions on it can also change the way can change the shape of this function. So the movement is somehow called adaptive, but it's adaptive because this landscape is moving, it's changing by the motion of this blue point, which is drawing that curve. And that's the trajectory in time over the fitness landscape. That can be this can be a genome space, and we will see the evolution of a species, or it can be the behavioral space, and we will see the evolution of economical outcomes, or it can be the metabolic production space, and we will see a route striving towards the optimization of biomass production, or problem-solving capacities, or whatever we want. So I guess the idea is clear. So the question is that whether or not goals are adaptive optimizations. That's kind of like the general question that we want to get through this paradigm. Are goals adaptive optimizations? And according to the current paradigm, we will tend to think, yes, most of the things we see, there are some things that are adapting. We have optimization processes, and that's how we might formalize the notion of goal. And interestingly, I introduced this idea of feedback loop, which is a notion coming from cybernetics. Adaptation is usually modeled as a feedback loop with the evolving environment. So there is an idea of evolving environment that I want to introduce. So the environment is changing. We have a feedback loop with it, and we are adapting through this feedback loop to the evolving environment. So, but there is a little problem with this idea, because there are something called as major transitions in evolution, for example, that involve the emergence of goals. What is, and this is another notion that I'm bringing in, which is the notion of emergence, which is also very important and used in the case of complex systems. And the emergence is a notion that I don't think I will dedicate much time to that today, but the simplest idea is that we have an arrow of emergence. So we start, for example, from life. Actually, the white background is the Big Bang and up to the chemical soup in the beginning of the living systems in the Earth. So we have the beginning of the universe in the white background until at some point life appears out of Big Bang and physical rules. So how come life emerges out of a chemical only realm? The biological realm, the realm of life, emerges from the realm of chemistry. So this emergent process changes the rules or changes the idea of goal, because the chemical system is merely evolving according to physicochemical rules. And all of a sudden, we got an evolutionary process in the sense of biology. We have cells, we have, well, like prokaryote cells, very simple forms of life that replicate and seek for different sort of principles, for evolutionary principles, than the chemical compounds that they were formed in the first place. So that's the idea of emergence. Like, how can you change from chemistry to biology, or from life, then we got consciousness. Then living systems evolve until at some point there is something called consciousness that appears. What is consciousness? We can think of it as an integrated network of experiences. That's more or less a very simple definition, because living systems evolve memory capacities, retrieval memory capacities, which allow them to behave in us one way or another. And these memory retrieval capacities and storage allow them at some point to create an integrated view of the world. And that's what we basically can start to think of as consciousness. Then with this consciousness, you can not just retrieve and memorize experiences, but also create your own sign functions, communicating with the other agents that have the same capacity as you or as those, until a language emerges. And then from language, we create norms, and from norms, we create societies and so on. So there is a hierarchy of emergent processes where the secondary process has a different goal from the goal of the primary process from which the emergent new system is created. This is the idea of emergence. And these are called major transitions because there is a sort of, let's say, kind of radical change of rules of what the evolution of the system is about. First, we have chemistry, then we got biology. First, we got biology, then we got cognition, and so on. So these major transitions imply the emergence of new goals. And then if we want to stick to the idea of understanding the goals of these new emergent systems as an optimization problem, as an optimization process, we will have to either deny free will, I think, this is just a philosophical discretion. If we want to think that all this is just increasing of entropy in the universe, we will start denying free will, or like allowing for some sort of anti-realism, something that we don't really know what reality is, or we know only very little portions of reality, just the physical level, and all that we don't care about because everything is just increasing entropy. That's not a satisfactory explanation, I guess, for most of us. We understand there are hierarchies and the goals also emerge. There are real goals, as we know in physics, but in the other layers of reality. Another option is to stop questioning and just believe that there is destiny, or there is a teleological explanation for all this that we don't need to know, we don't need to care necessarily because it's just the way it is, or we accept other easy way philosophical principles. So the idea is to think, okay, we have this now, we are clear that we have this. This is not compatible with the idea of optimization at the bottom, at the fundamental level, to say there is one variable that is optimized and that explains everything. So we need to go further and try to explain the notion of goal from some other principles. So and the important part of interdisciplinarity is that the interdisciplinary takes on reality imply that this idea that emergent goals are more the norm than the mysterious exceptions, because we see the major transitions in evolution, life, consciousness, and so on. This look, okay, well, we only have 5 to 6 problems in nature that we need to solve, and then all the rest could be optimization in the common sense, in the normal sense. But if we think of how do we understand our complex world, and I'm just making this picture for an abstraction. We have, for example, the industrial, city, and financial system, and we know these things are interconnected. And not just interconnected, they are multiply interconnected. So in that industry, in the context of some financial situation, what I'm trying to say in a few words, sorry, is that the interactions are not independent on each other. They are not just mere influences. The other things work as context for them to interact with the other. So we cannot think in the interaction of industry and city development without understanding the context in which the financial system is. And that happens for all possible interactions. We can, of course, simplify and reduce, but in principle, this is it. This is the case. And we do not just have industry, city development, and money. We have political, for example, political influences. We have biodiversity, climate change, or biological ecosystemic perspectives to understand the world. We also think of well-being of human beings, and why not of all creatures in the world. So all these fragmented perspectives about the reality of the world are necessary to be integrated to understand what is the goal of this whole system that we are living in, or the goal of the financial system, or the goal of the political system. We still need to integrate the fragmented perspectives used to describe each of these aspects of reality. So the idea of integration of fragmented perspectives is basically what explains why interdisciplinary takes on reality imply that the emergence of goals are the norm and not the exception. Because when we try to integrate different perspectives, we find that the rules that define the goal, or what define the optimization problem in one layer, plus the optimization problem of the other layer, you put them together, and the optimization problem is not just some of them. It is something that emerges out of the two of them, and it depends on the feedback, on the adaptations, on all these things that belong to complex systems. So this is why the approach here, or the fundamental idea that I would like to express in the remaining of the talk, is that we need to look for a framework where we can, from the very basics of the framework, allow for integration of fragmented perspectives and see what comes out from that. And what I will do now is to shortly review what complex systems are, how they are modeled, and what problems we find. So for complex system, we will understand something composed by many entities of possibly different nature, interacting in many, possibly or generally contextual ways. So these are the salient features of a complex system. So the first feature, I call it, this is my personal name on it because it has some resemblances to quantum theory, but it's not the take for this talk, although it's related. The idea of contextuality, which we can call non-trivial dependencies. So the interactions between the entities are not linear, not one way, one only way. They might have non-trivial dependencies, and that's what dependencies is, what we understand as context. So what is the effect of this is that we have complexity from scratch. When we have contextuality, for example, in communication, we know context matter a lot. So we don't have that the interpretation of speech acts is unidirectional. It's not just one possible interpretation to each thing we say. There are contexts which influence what we say, and on the one side influence what we say, and the other side influence what people understand from what we say. So that creates the complexity of communication. The second feature is feedback, which implies that the output act as input for next interactions. And what brings is regulation. It can be positive or negative feedback. I will not really dig much into that today, but the effect is regulation. Then we have another important feature, which is self-organization. Due to the feedbacks, due to these feedback loops or feedback connections between the interactions of the entities, we have a co-regulations of the parts, as we see, for example, with the ants or flocks of birds or stock market, this idea of self-organization. What self-organization implies that the feedback loops given by contextual interactions have as an effect the appearance of stable wholes. These stable wholes, as the flock of birds or the stability of the stock market, of several firms or values in shares in the stock market are given by the co-regulation of obtained from these feedback loops in the whole system, so complex system. And the emergence, which is what I was explaining before, is that these stable wholes formed by the co-regulations of the parts as a consequence of the feedback and contextuality end up behaving or end up appearing to our, at least to our perception, as new entities, like meta entities. So we have entities in the system, there is some sort of co-regulation, and there it appears something new, which can be seen as a system on its own. Like what happens with cells from biochemical processes to organisms, from cells to living ecosystems, from living beings, societies, from people, and so on. And what is the effect of the emergence is that there is going to be a hierarchy of complex systems, because we start from a very fundamental layer, atoms of chemistry, and then we get more and more layers where wholes appear to be entities which interact and create other higher element wholes. So these are, to me, in a nutshell, what the complex systems are. And then the idea is to build knowledge about complex systems, because now we need to think or conceive the idea of interdisciplinary takes on reality. We would like to explain the world not just looking at politics or money or ecosystem. We want all together. And when we have all that together, of course, we will have contextual interactions between one realm and the other. We also will have feedbacks, and that will imply self-organization and emergence. So these emergent systems out of interdisciplinary takes of reality are what I think we are missing at the moment. We don't see clearly that there are emergent stable wholes in the data we have of the world, and we are not really yet entirely clear that there are certain meta agents that can be identified. So that's a little bit the idea. And now I will briefly review how to model complex systems and why there are problems with the current paradigms, modeling paradigms. As a case for speaking, I will speak of an ecosystem, which is the paradigmatic case for a complex system. If we see the ecosystem is defined as a community of living organisms interacting as a system. So if we look at the definitions of each of these words, we will end up really rapidly understanding that ecosystems are complex systems, and everybody, or at least the people who work in this ecosystem modeling, in the past, they tend to think of food chains. So there is one guy that eats the other eats the other, and there is a pyramid of food. But then later takes, I mean the 50s, 60s, they end up understanding that this is a network phenomenon. It's not a hierarchical phenomenon, it's a network, and the network can have cycles which change entirely the topology of our understanding of nature. The lion is not the top, and the bacteria are not the bottom. There is a cycle. And when you have cycles, then the food chain, the food pathways are not so trivial. And then understanding the nature and the evolution and the impact of invasions of new species, or the spill of oil or something like that, anything you want to study, it's not going to just propagate from top to the bottom or from one layer to the other. It's going to have a full impact in the network. So then you need systemic understanding. And so in very simple terms, the four features that I review for complex systems are clearly explained in these examples. So the example for contextuality is how many available resources. The available resources in many cases modify the way in which species interact. They can compete or cooperate, for example, depending on how many available resources you have. And then the interaction is totally contextual. I will cooperate with the other if I have enough, and I will compete with the other if I don't. So feedback, prey-predator, locable terra systems. I don't know if you are familiar with it, but just, yeah, it is very common. And the other features are kind of self-explained, I think. Self-organization, when you have an invasion of a new species into the system, it will self-organize. Some of the species will die, some others will increase their amount, and then the system will sort of self-organize into a new state, which might be prejudicial or healthy for the ecosystem from our anthropocentric view. And the emergence of ecological communities, it's a typical case. We put some species living together, some grass, some things, and then the whole situation is going to evolve into an integrated, self-organized network of species. So to continue, how complex systems are studied. This is the Lotka-Volterra equation. So this is explaining the feedback. For those who don't know, I will briefly explain these equations explain the population of rabbits and the population of foxes in time. So we start from a certain concentration of rabbits and foxes, 0.5, just for whatever number to start with. And we see that the rabbits reproduce much faster than the foxes. So we have an increase of rabbit population, but because there are more rabbits, foxes have more food available. So they start eating more rabbits, and they increase more their population as well, because they are eating a lot, so they can reproduce faster. But at some point, there are so many foxes that they are hunting all the rabbits available, so the population of rabbits starts going down. So then the population of foxes cannot grow any longer so fast. So it starts reducing, and then until there are very little rabbits and very little foxes. So then because there are very little foxes, the rabbits can start reproducing again, which starts again the process. So that's why you get this not in phase periodic trajectories. So if you do equations to explain ecological interactions, you can be very precise at describing the time evolution of the amount of species in time. But the problem is that you can only solve it, at least analytically, which is one important part of the modeling and scientific work, to solve analytically or have an analytic expression of what you're talking about. So unfortunately, we can only solve linear and some systems, but they need to have very particular properties, which are not the case in general. So normally we can only solve very small systems. That's analytically. I mean, we can do numerical simulations for studying more complex systems. That's all right. But the problem is that numerical simulations leave you in a sort of void knowledge, because if you change the conditions and the system is chaotic or nonlinear, we cannot really know what's going to happen. So how can we learn from a system of equations that is chaotic? If we change the conditions, what we numerically solved, it's not going to be of any use. We can now rely on larger numerical simulations and so on, which is a nice strategy, but still is not well grounded. And also the fact that dynamical equations change over time. The very rules of evolution change over time. In real systems, the fact that this happened, that is incompatible with the modeling of differential equations as it is known normally, because you will have to have a system of differential equations that is changing over time, incorporating from time to time certain particular changes. And then if you do a numerical simulation of that, that's completely like, you learn nothing from it. That's the thing. If you have an evolving system whose rules evolve and you do numerical simulations of that, it's very little what you can predict, unless the system have particular regularities, which we cannot assume the system have in principle. That's a problem for most modeling tools, actually, but I will explain that we can advance a little further with this. So the norm in complex systems is the appearance changes of rules over time. So it's good approach. Of course, these have solved so many problems in science. The calculus-based descriptions But for complex systems, maybe it's not the best place to start from. Another prototypical form of modeling systems, ecosystems, is to use networks. Actually, the food chain, and then I was explaining that things are at least described by networks. So this network is the tip of the arrow. Like the head of the arrow is its, and the tail of the arrow is it's eaten by. So solar energy is eaten by the plant, and the plant is eaten by the grasshopper, and then you can continue describing this, what is called food web. So it's a network showing who is who. You can find, maybe this doesn't have any cycle, but normally you can even find cycles in it. So interesting, we can describe all the interactions of our species using the network. But the problem is that the arrow can only encompass one type of interaction. In this case, is eaten by. We could also have red arrows or purple arrows to express cooperates with, or is a parasite of, so other types of ecological interactions. But the problem is that then how can we integrate the different types of interactions in a single network model? There are approaches to do that, but the framework itself of networks is not from first principles applicable to situations of multiple interactions, because the network it's defined by one type of interaction. So then you will have to have multiple networks to incorporate multiple interactions. And then how to integrate these multiple networks, it's going to be definitely an ad hoc process. It's not coming from first principles from the language of networks itself. So then there is a little problem which can be solved case by case, but this is not from the ground of the modeling framework to be solved. It actually, there are many approaches in ecological modeling to handle these kind of multi-layer networks, and they have lots of new approaches, but I believe, and I have the impression that they cannot find common ground. They fight, my approach is better than yours. It's very common, but that's because there is no unifying language to start from. So of course, it's going to happen like that. And the other major way to model complex systems is to use agent-based modeling. So agent-based modeling, we simply define different types of agents, different types of rules, conditions, and an algorithm for the dynamical evolution, which is similar to modeling numerical simulations for for differential equations. But it's more beautiful because you can look what the agents do, you can change the conditions and so on. So similar, as I said, to dynamical equations, we can do numerical simulations on agent-based models. And this is something, if you do not agree with what I say here, I would be happy to discuss. Agent-based models I haven't found yet analytic methods to study agent-based models in general. How to define, for example, self-organization or emergence in an agent-based model, like theoretically speaking, for any agent-based model system, not for the one I am studying about whatever blocks in the world, and then I find emergence like in the game of life or something like that. I'm speaking of a fundamental layer of description to define complex systems, complex thinking concepts in the framework of agent-based models. Personally, I haven't found a framework of agent-based models that can be applied generally to all kinds of systems and having reasonable definitions of what is self-organization, emergence, or resilience, or this, what I mean is the system thinking concepts. The framework is good for making simulations, is great for that, but it doesn't provide you a layer to define these complex systems concepts from scratch. So I think that this is the problem, that we are trying to push the modeling of complex systems with paradigms that are meant to describe non-complex systems. So that's a little bit the idea. So I claim that agent-based modeling is a great modeling tool, but not so great for conceptual understanding. So now I will summarize briefly at the simulation point of view and at the conceptual point of view, the abilities that these three languages have for describing complex systems. At the simulation point of view, you can read, I will not dedicate much time, on only remark that all the yes should be blue and all the no should be black. Sorry, I made some changes last minute, but at the simulation point of view, we see mostly yes, because these languages are quite good for making simulations of the systems we want to describe. But at the conceptual point of view, there are no necessarily good frameworks or good ways to define in a general way these notions. And I introduce a final, a last row in the conceptual point of view for a notion called evolvability. Evolvability is, I will define now what it is, but to summarize, the bottom line is that these languages are not so bad, are quite good for doing simulations, but not for bringing about a deep conceptual understanding of the things we want to model. So this is a sort of interface between mathematics and philosophy problem that we need to create a language to connect the concepts to mathematical notions before we have the particular realm or the particular complex system we want to model. So evolvability is a novel feature, and I introduce it here because I think it's a truly complex systems property, and it's defined as the capacity for adaptive evolution. So any system that is capable of adaptive evolution is called evolvable. So it implies basically it implies two particular features. One is reproduction and the other is adaptation. So it's exactly what happens in Darwinian evolution, but just taken to a more structural side. So evolvable systems are those that can undergo evolutionary processes. That's more like the idea. And there are several variants of this concept, like the Evo-Devo approach. I will not dig much into that, but evolutionary drift or structural coupling, which are variants to describe or to speak or to analyze what evolvable systems are. And this picture on the left shows that how the structure of the network can change, implying changes at the dynamical level, at the structural level, and at the evolutionary capacities level too, which is like looking at the genome. If you change certain genes because the offspring has some new genes, then all the means or the affordances that the new generation has will imply the further evolution of the system. So that's what that's kind of like the bottom line for this part of the talk, which is ending kind of like now the motivation. The real challenge in complex systems is to formalize the features that define them in a conceptually sound and operationally tractable way, and hopefully computationally cheap as well, of course. But yeah, so if we all agree in that is the challenge, then I will move to describe another language which is very similar to traditional networks. It's called reaction networks, and it finally has various of the properties we were not finding in the other situations. But before that, I would like to introduce one concept that is called autopoiesis, developed by a Chilean from my land, from my country, scientist called Humberto Maturana, who passed away unfortunately this year. And autopoiesis means self-production. Why am I speaking about autopoiesis here? Because
we need to leave some time at the end for questions.
Oh yeah, how many minutes do I have?
15 minutes.
15 minutes plus questions or minus questions?
Plus questions.
Ah, yeah, no, I can totally go. Yeah. So autopoiesis. autopoiesis is a concept that is also very meaningful for complex systems, and it defines the idea of self-production. So why was it used by Maturana to define for his take on life? Because he defined like living systems as autopoietic systems. And what is an autopoietic system? It's a network of production processes of components. We are thinking of biological components, biochemical components, such that they continuously regenerate and constitute a unit that can be identified from the rest of the universe. So the idea is that we have a biochemical, like a metabolic system, that continuously self-reproduce itself by its own operation, and also constitutes an identity and a particular unit that can be spatially separated from the rest of the universe. So a cell, but expressed in more structural way. The idea of autopoiesis was taken to many other domains, like psychology, where you can explain the cycle of violence, which is a network of processes, of communicational and action processes that continuously regenerate itself and constitute a unit. So the cycle of violence, the cycle of poverty, or the cycle of CO2 and water cycle, and oxygen or atmospheric cycles. So this idea of cycle of processes that continuously regenerate and they exist as a collective unit of transformation, it's the idea of autopoiesis. So what I will go more quickly from now on, but the idea is that this idea captures the notion of complex systems, because we need to have transformation of components. So the system is not living in any of the nodes, it's the whole network of processes. And it exists, and it remains in time, and it remains as an observable unit from the external, from observers like us. It remains stable enough to be observed because it has this property. That's the deep idea, I think, that what we observe as complex system, it's a complex system because it's stable enough to be observed as such. And in order to be stable enough to be observed as such, it needs to be able to regenerate itself. Otherwise, we will just see a pathway passing by. We will not see the pattern repeating over and over, so we can tell from outside this is a complex system. That's the bottom line. And what we have been doing is try to formalize this idea. So basically, I will go very quickly here, thinking that chemistry, reaction networks, the framework of reaction networks, is a paradigm that is very useful to start thinking in this way, because molecules can break apart or join into others, so we get the feedback. Matter structures are stable in time, so we have self-organization of chemical processes and so on. So the idea is that chemistry, the language of chemical systems, it's a quite interesting language to explore for describing complex systems in general. So what is a reaction network, which is the particular implementation that we are working on? It's very simple. We got one reaction, three components, right? Two on the left, one on the right, that connects to another. So we got more reactions and more species, and they are interconnected. So the O2, for example, participates in two reactions. The H2O is product of two reactions. So the molecules participate as products or as reactants in different reactions, and this creates a network of productive interactions. We need to have in mind large reaction networks like metabolic cycles or metabolic systems. And because of time, I won't be able to explain all in detail, but I want to get to a particular notion, which is the closed set. The closed set is enough for the time being. So I will make a little clarification of notation. Let's think of a reaction network as a set of species, molecular species, and a set of reactions. So in this very simple case, we have three species, A, B, C, and we have one reaction, A plus B goes to C. The support or the reactants of the reactions are A, B, and C is the product. And now we look at the subsets of this reaction network. So this is the interesting object of study, the subnetworks of the reaction network. So I will take a particular set of species A, If I take only A, the subsystem A, I have no reaction to trigger because I need at least A and B to trigger something. If I have A and B, then I can apply the reaction R, but finally, if I have only A and B, I immediately have C as well. So A and B, we can say, is not closed because it can produce something that is not within the system. If I have A, B, and C, I have the whole system, so it's closed. The idea of closed reaction network is given by this idea that when you take a subnetwork, you have to think we have many reactions. You take a subnetwork and you see all what can be produced by this subnetwork, and all what it is produced is already contained in the network, so then it's closed. If not, it still has some productive capacity and will expand until it reaches some closed set. And if you start from a very large universe of reactions, you will have many closed sets in between. I will show this very quick. So this has been used to model this idea of reaction networks for political systems, economical systems, decision systems, or ecological systems. I will briefly explain how reactions can be used to model ecological interactions. This is the example. For example, prey plus predator gives two predators. So the predator eats the prey and reproduces itself. And then you get a model of an ecological interaction using a chemical-like network. So all the interactions can be done, and particularly competition. For the notion of competition, you need competitor 1 plus resource gives two competitors. Competitor 2 plus resource gives two competitors. That's a model of competition, but you cannot do it with one single reaction. You need at least two. So the idea is that ecological interactions are not just chemical reactions, but networks of reactions. So the mechanics of the interaction is described as a collection of reactions or as a reaction network, as I'm saying. So then this is a little bit more complicated, but we can briefly saying we can operationalize the idea of autopoietic system by defining the notion of process, which is the application of reactions one after the other, so that the production of the whole pathway of reactions does not deplete in any side the reaction, the network. So for example, in this simple example, we need to apply particularly 2 times each reaction so the whole system reproduces itself. So there are pathways that self-produce the system and other pathways that do not self-produce the system. So these pathways, or processes as we call, are self-maintaining if they produce more or the same than when they consume. And when we have a reaction network that is closed and self-maintaining, we have a unit that can self-produce itself, and it's also not producing anything but itself. So it's operationally closed and self-maintaining. Thus, it's an abstract model of autopoietic system. So that's what I was explaining here. And there are mathematical theorems that allow to connect this with the dynamics of the reaction network. So there is this idea of hierarchy of organizations, closed and self-maintaining subnetworks, which I will explain here. And with this and one more slide, I finish, Professor Osal. So I think I might match the time. So if we start from a reaction network, having 4 species, A, B, C, and D, we have this hierarchy of possible subsets, possible subnetworks. Each of these subnetworks will have some of the properties I've been talking about. Some subnetworks will be closed, some other will be self-maintaining, some other will have some other properties. So we can sort of color these subnetworks and have an abstract view on the productive capacities of them. This is what we do with what is called chemical organization theory. In this case, the green nodes of this hierarchy are those that are able to be stable enough to be observed, as I said before. They are closed and self-maintaining. All the others, we can discard them as possible, as potential subsets of the system at which the system can stabilize at. The system could not be able to stabilize at any other but the 3 green nodes, because it needs to be self-produced and it needs to be closed. So this is what is mathematically can be shown. I won't describe that more in detail. And this is when you go one step further. You identify, get a reaction network, identify which are the potentially stable parts of it, and then we analyze under which conditions you go from one to the other. So if the concentrations changes in one way, you go to this. If the concentrations changes in another way, you go to the other. And if a new reaction, a new rule comes in, we simply open up the span of this to more possibilities. We identify the new organizations, the new stable enough to be observed system, and we expand or we shrink. If something is eliminated, we just take that off, eliminate this, those nodes, and reobtain the organizational structure. So the set of organizations in the end is an abstract view of the long-term stable dynamics. So we don't need to calculate the numerical simulations. We can know from scratch or in advance what can possibly be stable in the long run. And that gives us an interesting perspective to understand the meta systems, the emergent systems out of this universe of interactions. So this is why this is maybe what I think, what is proposed. Given a reaction network, instead of solving the differential equations, we compute the organizations first, which is actually, technically speaking, is much cheaper than solving the equations. And the organizations will then form the stable metastructures that emerge out of this complex system description. So we can model, and then the blue thing shows that all the features that we were finding problematic for other languages, in this language, they can be somehow solved. And I will finish with this slide giving the conclusions. So it can be read maybe while the questions are asked. So no more time waste on explaining. So thank you.
Thank you. There's some time for questions, either from the audience here or from most listeners online.
Also, people are, I think I shall share the full screen.
Although maybe you want to stop the recording?
Yes.
Because we can keep it only the lecture.
Right.
Metti in pausa la registrazione, interrompi, no?
Interrompo.